The recording had already been paused 3 times before the instructor finally left it running. Not because the footage was difficult to find. Not because the equipment had malfunctioned. The instructor, a senior docent of conflict historiography at the Velhari Continuing Institute, a being who had spent 61 years cataloging the worst moments of 42 civilizations, paused it because something in the footage kept making him lose his place. He couldn't explain that. He was trained not to lose his place. The classroom held 23 students. The lights had been dimmed. The holographic display filled the front wall 12 meters wide, floor to ceiling, and every student in that room had gone completely silent. Not the performative silence of students trying to appear engaged. The other kind. The kind that happens when something in a room changes the air. The footage showed a battlefield. And somewhere in it, moving through smoke and ruin and dying light, was something none of them could quite identify. The course was called Civilizational Collapse, Tactical Vectors and Psychological Signatures, and it was considered, among students of the Velhari Institute, to be the most disturbing elective in the entire catalog. Not because of its workload. Because of what it required you to look at over and over, until you understood that intelligent life, regardless of biology, regardless of culture, regardless of every philosophical framework any civilization had ever constructed to protect itself from the knowledge, was remarkably consistent in the ways it destroyed itself. Docent Farath Vel had taught the course for 19 years. He had shown students footage from the Keth massacres, the purging of Ondavar Station, the slow civilizational suicide of the Meyerhan, a species so philosophically advanced they had argued themselves into collective paralysis and simply stopped reproducing. He had shown footage that made students leave the room. He had shown footage that made students weep. He had shown footage so tactically precise, so surgically brutal, that students had sat in silence for 11 minutes afterward before anyone spoke. None of that footage had made him pause the recording. This one he had paused 3 times. And now, watching it again, he realized he still hadn't answered the question that had first made him stop. He didn't know whose side he was supposed to be watching. Docent Farath Vel. The voice came from the 3rd row. A student named Ori Then, younger than most of the cohort, with the particular stillness that Farath Vel had learned to associate with either extreme boredom or extreme attention. In Ori Then's case, it was always the latter. Yes. The footage designation in the archive list, it's labeled as Keth Expansion Period Contested Corridor Engagement Sector 12, but the Keth didn't operate in Sector 12 during that period. Their supply lines couldn't support it. Farath Vel looked at her. Correct. So who mislabeled it? He let the silence hold for a moment. That, he said, is the first of several things about this footage that I cannot explain. He pressed play. The battlefield on the display was a ruin of something that had once been a processing installation, the kind of structure common across 100 inhabited systems, built from the same modular components, following the same guild standard schematics. Its skeleton was still recognizable, twisted metal ribs jutting upward through smoke, collapsed walkways, the faint blue phosphorescence of ruptured coolant lines painting the ground in slow, spreading pools. The combatants on one side were Keth. That much was certain. The armored silhouettes, the formation patterns, the particular way their units communicated through bioluminescent pulse signaling, all of it matched Keth tactical doctrine from the period. They outnumbered the opposing force by what the archive's own combat analysis overlay estimated at 11-1. The opposing force was harder to categorize. They moved in small clusters, never more than 4 together. They used cover in ways that the Keth formation algorithms clearly hadn't anticipated, because the Keth kept repositioning to account for movement that, according to standard doctrine, should not have been possible from a unit that size taking that level of fire. They were losing ground. Measurably, consistently, sector by sector, the archive overlay showed their perimeter contracting. And yet, "They're not retreating," said a student in the back row. His name was Corval Das, older than the others, a transfer from the military sciences track. He leaned forward. "They have 3 clear exit vectors. The Keth haven't closed them. Why aren't they retreating?" "Watch," said Farath Vel. On the display, one of the small cluster's 4 figures moving through the wreckage stopped, not because they were pinned. The Keth fire in that section had shifted. There was, for approximately 40 seconds, a genuine opening. Enough time, enough cover. A clear path toward the eastern exit vector that the archive overlay had flagged in pale green. The cluster didn't take it. Instead, one figure separated from the group. Moved not toward the exit but laterally, deeper into the contested zone, toward a section of collapsed walkway where the archive overlay showed. Fereth Vel had noticed this on his first viewing and still didn't fully understand it. A concentration of Keth communication relays. The figure moved alone. "That's a suicide run," Corval Das said, not dramatically, as a flat observation. "They know that's a suicide run. The unit does appear to recognize the statistical outcome, yes," Fereth Vel said. "Based on the formation response, watch the other 3. The other 3 members of the cluster did something the archive's tactical AI had flagged as an anomaly. They didn't cover the solo figure's advance. They didn't retreat. They moved in the opposite direction, drawing Keth attention, pulling fire, behaving in a way that from a pure force preservation standpoint made absolutely no tactical sense. They were spending themselves, deliberately, not to win the engagement, to give one figure 40 additional seconds in a communication relay junction. "What's in the relay junction?" a student asked. "Nothing," Fereth Vel said. According to the Keth operational records recovered from this period, the junction had already been decommissioned. It was tactically worthless. The room went quiet again. On the display, the solo figure reached the junction. There was a flash. The archive overlay categorized it as an improvised detonation, low yield, the kind of device assembled from available components rather than standard munitions. The junction collapsed. 3 seconds later, Keth bioluminescent signaling across the entire engagement sector went dark. Not reduced, dark. "The junction wasn't decommissioned," Orithen said. "No," said Fereth Vel, "it was not. The Keth records were wrong, or the Keth records were deliberately falsified after the fact, which presents an entirely different set of questions." He paused. "But that is not what I want you to look at." He rewound the footage 17 seconds, froze it. Enhanced the image around the solo figure at the moment they had separated from the cluster. "Look at the suit designation, the marking on the left shoulder plate." 23 students leaned forward in varying degrees. Corval Das spoke first. "That's not Keth. No, that's not any of the contested corridor factions from this period. I've seen every faction insignia catalog from the Keth expansion records. That marking doesn't appear in any of them." "No," said Fereth Vel. "It does not." Orithen's voice when she spoke was completely level. "Docent, who is the human?" The room shifted. Not dramatically, no one gasped, no one stood up, but something changed in the quality of the silence. Fereth Vel had felt it before in other classrooms in other moments. The moment when a question arrives that is slightly too large for the room it's asked in. "That," he said, "is what we are here to find out." He had found the footage 11 weeks ago, while reviewing archival submissions for a separate research project on communication warfare. It had been filed under 17 different catalog headings, cross-referenced with 4 different conflict periods, and attributed to 6 different recording sources, none of which, when he traced them, actually existed. The footage itself was genuine. The archive's authentication protocols confirmed that without ambiguity. The metadata surrounding it was a labyrinth of redirections that seemed, the more he followed them, to have been constructed specifically to make the footage difficult to find. Not impossible, difficult. There was a difference, and Fereth Vel had spent 19 years learning to notice that difference. Impossible meant someone wanted the footage gone. Difficult meant someone wanted the footage to survive, just not easily. "Before we continue," he told the class, "I need to establish some baseline context. How many of you have completed the prerequisite module on Terran civilizational contact history? 15 hands, better than he'd expected. How many of you would describe that module as comprehensive? 12 hands dropped immediately. The remaining 3 went down more slowly as their owners apparently reconsidered. "Correct," Fereth Vel said. "The module is not comprehensive. It was written in the 3rd decade after formal contact, during the period when the prevailing institutional position was that Terran civilization represented a Category 3 emerging culture, technologically developing, psychologically volatile, strategically negligible. He let the last phrase sit. The module reflects that position. But they weren't, said Corval Das. It wasn't a question. The position, Farethvel said carefully, was not entirely wrong. Terran technology at contact was, by galactic standards, developing. Their biology imposed genuine physical limitations. Their civilization was, in measurable ways, fragile. He paused again. What the module failed to account for, what almost every institutional assessment of that period failed to account for, was a variable that our standard analytical frameworks did not have a category for. What variable? Someone asked from the back. We are going to spend the next 3 sessions finding out. He turned back to the display. But first, the footage. He showed them 4 more sequences from the same archive file. Each one had been authenticated. Each one was labeled with the same web of misattributions, the same labyrinthine catalog entries. Each one showed the same engagement, or what appeared to be the same engagement, though the archive's own timestamp data suggested the sequences had been recorded across a period of 8 days, not in a single battle. In the second sequence, the same small cluster, reduced now from 4 figures to 3, had established a defensive position in what the Keth operational records described as a collapsed and uninhabitable section of the installation's lower processing level. The Keth had not reinforced against that section because, according to their own tactical assessment, it was structurally unsound. No rational combatant would hold a position in a structurally unsound location. The cluster held it for 61 hours. How? Corval Das asked. The question sounded involuntary. We don't have internal footage from that section, Farethvel said. We have Keth reconnaissance logs from the perimeter. The logs describe what the Keth observers characterized as inexplicable persistence, which is not a tactical designation. It's an observation that had no tactical category in Keth doctrine. He pulled up the text of the log entry. The precise phrasing translated is, "They remained. We do not understand why they remained. There was nothing tactically compelling about remaining." There was something personally compelling, Orithen said quietly. Every head in the room turned toward her. Maybe that's the variable, she said, the one that didn't have a category. Farethvel looked at her for a moment. Keep that thought, he said. You'll need it later. In the third sequence, the cluster had been reduced to 2. The footage here was degraded, the recording source had been damaged, the image fragmented and flickering, but the archive's enhancement protocols were sufficient to reconstruct key frames. What they showed was a Keth negotiation team approaching the cluster's position under a signal of non-aggression, not a combat approach, a deliberate, formal request for communication. The 2 figures in the cluster received them. This is the part, Farethvel said, that the Keth records describe in the most detail, because it was, by their account, the most confusing thing that occurred during the entire engagement. He played the audio from the Keth side of the exchange. Translation overlay rendered it in standard script at the bottom of the display. Keth negotiator, your situation is untenable, your force has been reduced, your resources are depleted. The rational conclusion of these facts is that you should accept cessation terms. A pause. Then the response, audio partially damaged but recoverable. Human voice, we've had this conversation. My answer is the same. Keth negotiator, your previous answer was given when you had 4 capable combatants. You now have 2. Human voice, I'm aware of that. Keth negotiator, then you understand that the rational calculation has changed. A longer pause. When the voice came back, something in its texture had shifted, not louder, not harder, something quieter and more fundamental than either of those things. Human voice, the rational calculation and I parted ways about 60 hours ago. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop bringing it up. The Keth negotiation team, according to their own after-action report, had withdrawn to consult. They had spent 3 hours attempting to categorize the response using existing frameworks for negotiation, psychological assessment, and combat stress behavioral prediction. Their conclusion, filed as an official tactical assessment, was 4 words. Classification remains pending. Proceed with caution. The room was very still. They thought it was a tactic, said Corval Das. Yes. The Keth thought the human was performing irrationality as a strategy, to seem unpredictable, to make them hesitant. That was their first conclusion, yes. But it wasn't a tactic. Fereth Vel looked at him. No, it was not. The fourth sequence was the one that had made him pause the recording on his first viewing and not immediately understand why. The installation had, by this point, effectively fallen. The Keth had consolidated control of every major section. The eastern exit vectors remained open, the same ones that had been open from the beginning, the same ones the cluster had consistently refused to use. The tactical overlay showed the two remaining figures positioned in what had once been a monitoring station, elevated, with clear sightlines across 3 approach corridors. They were not attempting to hold the position. They were not attempting anything defensive at all. They were working. The enhanced footage showed them with components spread across the floor, stripped from the station's systems, from their own equipment, from things that, when Fereth Vel had run the image through a materials analysis protocol, turned out to include pieces of the suits themselves. They're building something, said a student near the front. Yes. Out of what's left of their own equipment. Yes. What are they building? Fereth Vel had spent 9 weeks trying to answer that question. He had run the image data through 6 different engineering analysis systems, consulted with 2 colleagues in the Applied Technology faculty, and submitted a formal query to the Velhari Institute's restricted archive, the one that required senior faculty authorization and a documented research justification, and still took 4 weeks to return a response. The response, when it came, had been 3 lines. Query received. Query reviewed. Query referred to Office of Contact Historical Review for assessment. He had not received a follow-up. I don't know what they're building, he told the class. I have hypotheses. The materials analysis suggests it involves the communication systems from the monitoring station, modified using components I cannot fully identify. But the completed device, if it was completed, does not appear in any subsequent Keth operational record. Because the Keth didn't know what it was either, Orithen said. That is one possible explanation. Or because whoever filed those records didn't want anyone to know what it was, she said. The same way whoever built the archive labyrinth didn't want anyone to easily find this footage. Fereth Vel did not answer that immediately. He let the silence do the work. Then, the 5th sequence. I want you to watch this carefully. Specifically, watch the Keth commanders. Not the figures in the monitoring station. Watch what happens to the Keth commanders when the device activates. The 5th sequence was 47 seconds long. In the first 12 seconds, nothing visibly changed. The Keth formation patterns held. The monitoring station showed 2 figures still working. At second 13, something happened that the archive's audio reconstruction captured but couldn't classify. A frequency. Not a signal in any standard communication band. The archive had checked against every known protocol in its database. Something older, or something different, or something that had been deliberately designed to fall outside every known protocol in the database. It lasted 4 seconds. At second 17, the Keth commanders went still. Not the combatants, the commanders. The ones at the back of the formation, the ones linked into the operational coordination network, the ones responsible for maintaining the bioluminescent pulse signaling that held the entire Keth force in cohesive action. They stopped moving, not dramatically, not falling, not reacting. They simply stopped. What did it do to them? Someone asked. According to Keth medical records from the period, records that are, I will note, much easier to find than this footage, 17 Keth field commanders in the engagement sector were admitted to medical facilities within 6 hours of this timestamp. The stated diagnosis in Keth medical terminology translates approximately as acute disorientation of the coordination faculty. Fereth Vel looked at the class. In simpler terms, they couldn't coordinate. For approximately 19 hours, every Keth field commander in the sector lost the ability to maintain synchronized command function. The device disrupted their coordination biology, Corval Das said. Specifically, Not a general weapon, something targeted at the specific biological mechanism they used to command. Yes. Assembled from stripped monitoring equipment and pieces of their own suits. Yes. In 60-odd hours, by two people. Corval Das stopped. He looked at the frozen image on the display. They knew what they were doing. From the beginning, none of this was improvised. The whole engagement, the holding of the position, the 61 hours in the structurally unsound section, the refusal to take the exit vectors, it was all buying time to build that device. That, said Farath Vel, is the first interpretation. It is logical. It is consistent with the evidence. It was also almost certainly wrong. The room shifted again. What's the second interpretation? Ori then asked. He had been waiting for that question. He had been waiting 3 sessions in a different sense and 11 weeks in another, from the moment he'd first found the footage and understood, slowly and with growing discomfort, what he was actually looking at. The second interpretation, he said, requires you to look at the timestamp on sequence 3, the negotiation sequence. Look at the exact moment the human voice says, he pulled the transcript back up, the rational calculation and I parted ways about 60 hours ago. Now look at the engineering analysis data from sequence 4, the device components, the modifications. He gave them 15 seconds. He watched Ori Then's face as she worked through it. He had learned over 19 years to read the exact moment a student's expression changed from active analysis to something quieter. Her expression changed. The device work started before the negotiation, she said. The device work started before the fourth figure was lost. The 61 hours in the unsound section, they weren't waiting, they were working. Yes, the exit vectors were never an option they were considering. They were never trying to survive the engagement. No, they went in knowing they weren't leaving. The word knowing hung in the air of the room. Not hoping, not expecting, knowing. All 4 of them, Ori Then said. From the beginning. This is the hypothesis, Farath Vel said. I cannot prove it definitively, but the timeline supports it. The behavior supports it. And there is one additional piece of evidence. He paused. He had been thinking about how to present this piece for 11 weeks. He still wasn't certain he had found the right words. In the Keth after-action records, buried in a logistics subfile that references this engagement only obliquely, there is a notation about a communication intercept. A message, originating from inside the installation before the engagement began, that the Keth decryption team recovered and could not at the time interpret. He pulled the intercept up on the display. The translation was imperfect. The message had been encoded, and the decryption was a reconstruction rather than a clean read, but the core of it was legible. Confirmed 4 volunteer entry. Estimated operational window 72 hours against projected Keth response time. Device specifications transmitted. If signal received, objective complete. If signal not received, assume device failure, attempt secondary approach. Do not attempt extraction. Repeat, do not attempt extraction, we know. End. The room was silent for a very long time. We know, Corval Das read. The words seemed to cost him something to say aloud. They told their own command not to try to save them. They called themselves volunteers. 4 volunteers, Farath Vel said. Against 11-to-1 odds, holding a position for 8 days in a structurally condemned installation, in a sector the Keth had already written off as consolidated because that's what made the sector vulnerable, that's why it was chosen. The Keth weren't watching a sector they'd already won. What was the device for? Ori then asked. Not what it did to the Keth commanders. What was the bigger objective? Why disrupt coordination in this sector for 19 hours? And here was the center of it. Here was the thing that had kept Farath Vel from sleeping properly for 11 weeks, that had made him submit the restricted archive query, that had made him design an entire 3-session course sequence around a single piece of footage he couldn't fully explain. He looked at the class, all 23 of them, leaning forward now without realizing it, the way people lean forward when they are about to receive information that will change the shape of something they thought they understood. 19 hours of Keth command disruption in this sector, he said. Cross-reference with Keth expansion campaign records from the same period. What happened 19 hours after this timestamp in the adjacent corridor system that the historical record attributes to a failed Keth supply operation. Corval Das had his research tablet out. He found it in approximately 30 seconds. His face changed. "The Ondavar Relief Convoy," he said. 12 transports. It passed through the adjacent corridor uncontested. The Keth response that should have intercepted it never materialized. The historical record says the Keth operation failed due to command coordination failure of unknown origin. He looked up slowly. 400,000 people on Ondavar Station. That's what the convoy was carrying supplies for. They were running out of... He stopped. 4 people walked into an installation to die so a convoy could pass through a corridor for 19 hours. And the history books called it a failed Keth supply operation, Orithen said. Bureaucratic misattribution, Farathvel said. Or deliberate misattribution. I have a working hypothesis about which, but I cannot prove it yet. He paused. What I can tell you is this. I submitted the restricted archive query 6 weeks ago. I received a referral notice. I have received nothing since. Yesterday morning, I found that 3 of the 5 catalog pathways I used to locate this footage have been reclassified, not deleted. Reclassified, moved to access tiers that require clearances I do not hold. Orithen was completely still. Someone is still managing this footage. Someone has been managing this footage for a very long time. To hide it, to control who finds it, he said, and perhaps to ensure that someone eventually does. He looked at the frozen display, the 2 figures in the monitoring station, surrounded by the stripped components of their own equipment, building the thing that would save 400,000 lives they would never be told they'd saved. The question I keep returning to is not who built the archive labyrinth. I think I know the answer to that, though I cannot prove it. The question I keep returning to is why. He looked at the class. Why would the humans, and I am confident enough now to say it plainly, these were Terran operatives acting during a period when Terran civilization was officially classified as strategically negligible with no formal sanction from any galactic institution. Why would they not only do this but then spend decades ensuring the record survived, not erased, not celebrated, just preserved, waiting? For what? Someone asked. For a class, Orithen said softly. For a room full of people who would ask the right questions. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Farathvel didn't break it immediately. He let it settle, the way certain kinds of understanding need to settle, not absorbed in a moment, but accumulated, layer by layer, like something geological. I want you to think carefully, he said finally, about what you now understand about the Ondavar convoy relief operation, about how the history describes it, about what the history does not describe. And I want you to ask yourselves how many other events in the Keth expansion records, in any conflict records from any period, might be attributed to failed operations, bureaucratic mismanagement, coincidental timing. How many entries in the catalog of galactic history might look, from the inside, like a corridor that was inexplicably clear for 19 hours. Corval Das set his research tablet down. He didn't pick it up again for the rest of the session. There are records from the early contact period, Farathvel continued, and I want to be precise. I have not been able to access all of them, and the ones I have accessed I cannot always fully interpret. But there are records suggesting that Terran covert operations during the Keth expansion period were not isolated incidents. There is a pattern of engagements, mislabeled and misattributed, that share specific characteristics. Small unit size, asymmetric resource use, outcomes disproportionate to force deployed. And this is the characteristic that first drew my attention, an absence of survivor testimony. Not because there were no survivors on the Terran side, but because no survivor ever spoke to an official record. They didn't want credit, Corval Das said. He sounded like the words surprised him as he said them. More than that, Farathvel said, they didn't want discovery, not then. The operations only worked because because every assessment body in the galaxy classified Terran civilization as strategically negligible. The moment that classification changed, the operational model stopped working. He paused. Think about what that means. Think about what a civilization has to believe about itself, about the value of individual lives, about the relationship between sacrifice and outcome, about what is worth doing even when no one will ever know you did it, to spend decades operating in secret not out of shame, but out of strategic necessity. To build into every operation the assumption that no one would come for you, and to sign your own communications we know, and to mean it. The room was very still. Outside, through the building's upper ventilation panels, the ordinary sounds of the Institute continued: foot traffic, distant conversation, the routine percussion of a functioning academic institution going about its day. Fareth Vel had noticed, in this moment in previous sessions of this course, how strange it always seemed, the way the ordinary world continued on the other side of a door while, inside, something shifted permanently. "I want to show you one more thing," he said. "This is not from the restricted archive. This is from the public record available to anyone, cross-referenceable without special clearance, but it requires you to hold everything you now know while you look at it." He pulled up a standard historical document, the Galactic Contact Commission's official assessment of Terran civilization, filed in the 43rd year after formal contact. It was well known. Most students in the Institute had encountered it at some point. Several in the room had read it as part of their prerequisites. He highlighted a single paragraph. He read it aloud. "Terran civilization presents no significant strategic concern to established galactic institutions. Their technology remains below competitive threshold. Their military capacity is limited by biology, resource constraints, and internal political fragmentation. Their psychological profile, particularly their documented tendency toward emotional decision-making over rational optimization, renders them unsuitable for complex multi-theater operations. Assessment category: emerging, priority level, observation, recommended action, continued monitoring." He let the paragraph settle over the room like sediment. "This assessment," he said, "was filed 4 months before the Ondavar relief convoy passed through a clear corridor for 19 hours. He paused. "It was written by the most senior analysts in the Commission, using every framework and methodology available to galactic institutional assessment. They were not unintelligent. They were not careless. They were working from the best information they had, and every conclusion they reached was categorically, precisely, completely wrong, not because their methodology failed, but because the variable they needed to account for didn't exist in their methodology." "The thing that doesn't have a category," Orithen said quietly. "Yes. What do we call it?" He considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. He had been thinking about an answer for 11 weeks. "The Commission," he said, "would eventually create a category." In the 78th year after contact, following a series of events that we will discuss in the next session, events that, I will tell you now, make this footage look like a minor introductory exhibit, the Commission revised its framework for civilizational assessment. They added a new variable. They called it, in the technical language of the revised document, Persistent Non-Rational Commitment Index. He paused. "It is a very precise term," he said. "It is also, I think, a term designed by people who had been badly frightened and wanted the thing that frightened them to fit inside a box." He looked at the display, still showing the assessment paragraph, its careful clinical language, its confident conclusions. "The humans I would use a different word." "What word?" Corval Das asked. Fareth Vel was quiet for a moment, not performing quietness, genuinely searching for the word that was honest rather than merely accurate. "Devotion," he said finally. "Not to a goal, not to an outcome, to each other. To the 400,000 people on a station they would never visit. To the convoy workers who would never know their names. To the students, maybe, in a classroom they would never see, being asked questions by an instructor who found their footage because they built a labyrinth specifically designed to be solved." He paused. "Every strategic model we have, every framework for understanding what a civilization will do under pressure, what it will sacrifice, where it will stop, assumes that rational self-preservation is the foundational drive, assumes that every civilization at some level is operating from a calculation of cost and benefit, assumes that there is a threshold beyond which the cost becomes too high." He looked at the class. "The Commission called that threshold the rational cessation point. It appears in every assessment model we use. It is, in the language of civilizational analysis, considered axiomatic. Ori Then was looking at the display, not at the paragraph, at the frozen image underneath it, the two figures in the monitoring station, the components of their own suits spread around them. Humans don't have one, she said, not as a question. Humans, Vel said, have one. They reach it regularly. They know exactly where it is. He paused. And then some of them keep going. The room was very still. Outside, the ordinary sounds of the institute. Inside, 23 students and one instructor sitting with something that had no clean place to put it, not in any framework, not in any methodology, not in any careful clinical category. Something that had been waiting in a deliberately difficult archive for the right person to find it and bring it into a room and let it do what it had always been going to do. For next session, Vel said, I want each of you to find one event in the galactic historical record from any period, any conflict, any domain that the record attributes to coincidence, accident, or unexplained factors. Pull the primary source materials. Check the timestamps. Cross-reference with Terran contact period operational patterns. He paused. If you find something that doesn't fit the official explanation, if you find a corridor that was clear for 19 hours, or a commander who suddenly couldn't coordinate, or a position that held longer than physics should have allowed, I want you to bring it here. He looked at the display one last time. The two figures, the stripped equipment, the thing they were building that would save people they would never meet in a history that would never record their names. The question at the top of today's session was, who is the human? He closed the footage file. The display went dark. I want you to understand that this is not a question with a single answer. It is not a question about identity or allegiance or what the suit designation means. Question the real question, the one that has apparently been waiting in a deliberately built archive for 60 years to be asked in a room like this, is what they understood about themselves and about each other that made them walk through that door in the first place. He paused. Not what they were willing to die for. That part is legible in the footage. The harder question, the one I have not answered in 11 weeks of looking, is what they thought the dying was. He picked up his materials from the lectern. The galaxy has spent 80 years building categories for that answer, he said. The commission has a term. The military analysts have models. The philosophical institutions have published volumes. He stopped at the door. None of them feel right to me. I suspect they didn't feel right to the humans either. I suspect that's why they kept the record the way they did, not explained, not celebrated, not summarized. Just the footage, just the question. Just the sound of a voice saying we know and meaning it in a way that no framework has successfully described. He opened the door. The ordinary sounds of the institute came in, louder now. Class dismissed. Ori Then stayed in her seat. So did Corval Das. Around the room, others paused in the process of gathering their things and didn't immediately know why they had paused. On the now dark display, the after image of the two figures lingered for a moment in the way of bright light against a dark surface. Present in the visual memory, even after the source was gone, building something in the dark out of pieces of themselves, running out of time and utterly uninterested in that fact. The galaxy had named that quality eventually, in careful institutional language, and filed it in a category with a precise technical index. But in a corridor somewhere, in a record the Keth had written off and a commission had misclassified, and an archive had quietly preserved through a labyrinth that took 60 years to solve, two people had simply worked through the night with what they had left, not because they expected to survive it, not because anyone would remember it, not because the calculation favored it, because 400,000 people needed a corridor to be clear, and because they had looked at each other and said, we know. And meant that's enough.